Hello and welcome to Narrative Drivetime, where we talk to storytellers about storytelling. I'm Craig Colby. I've been telling stories on television for 30 years as an executive producer, writer, director, and I also own a storytelling company called Colbyvision. And that guy right there is Scott Colby, best-selling author and editor at the Toronto Star. He's going to talk to us today about writing different genres, and we're going to have a good time doing that. And right off the bat, we should acknowledge Craig Colby, Scott Colby. Not an accident. Yes, I've known him all his life, and we lived in the same house because he is my brother. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you for having me.
Very, very happy to have you here. Second happiest only maybe to mom, maybe dad. Yep. But let's start by talking about where did you first get the desire to start writing?
It's a good question. Well, this is a little known fact. So I was in university, and I immediately joined the student newspaper my first week at Western. So I went to the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, and I signed up as a photographer. And that was very exciting. Our grandfather, as you know, Dutch Colby, was a portrait photographer. And
I know him.
So he inspired me to want to be a photographer. But this is the absolute truth. I was inspired to meet girls. So... Yeah. So I was covering a cross-country championship, and I was shy, believe it or not. And there were these cute girls who were on the team. And I remember seeing the reporter who was covering it at the time talking to all these girls. And I was shy, and I thought, wow, if I was a reporter, I would have an excuse to talk to these girls. But that was kind of what happened. But it was more than that. I visitor. Anyway, so I thought it would be more challenging and more rewarding to write the stories and take the pictures. That was what really inspired me to try and become a writer and move away from the photography.
And, you know, a lot of people go to school to pursue their career, which you did. What I think is interesting about what you did is your extracurricular actually was what drove you into the business that you ended up doing.
That's correct. So my first year at Western, again at the Gazette, the editor-in-chief was a fellow by the name of Kevin Donovan, and he looked like someone right out of Central Casting. He had the tweed coat with the patches on the elbows, and he ended up that year, after being editor of the Gazette, he got a job at the Toronto Star right away as a reporter. And I thought this was an amazing thing, that you could become a journalist at this largest paper in the country without having a journalism degree. You just needed the experience running the newspaper. So yeah, that really was eye-opening for me. And yeah, so I got a degree in history because I basically needed a degree in something. And, I took a lot of politics as well. And both politics and history helped me a lot to become a journalist. So
you're out of school. You are now writing for, you went home to Thunder Bay and wrote for the local paper. That's where you started.
Yeah. I had a summer internship at London Free Press, which was very informative. That was a great experience. It's only 4 months, but I learned a year's worth of school, probably more, 2 years worth of school in those 4 months. And then I went to Thunder Bay to work for the Thunder Bay paper as a full-time reporter.
What did you learn in your internship?
Just because the Thunder Bay paper wasn't very good. Standards were low. There weren't many people there who could inspire you and mentor you. But at the Free Press, there were a lot of really talented people. And at the time, it was a very good paper. It was a regional paper. They had bureaus in Ottawa and in Queen's Park and all around southwestern Ontario. And there were very talented, very smart people there who were happy to teach me. So I just basically learned the attitude of being a professional journalist, of having set big goals, what is required of you, the standards. For fact checking and for reliability and trustworthiness, all those things.
Now, for people who haven't written in this style, What are the keys to writing successfully as a reporter?
Yeah, as a reporter, you need to be able to. So your stories are probably in the neighborhood of anywhere from 500 to maybe 2,000 words, probably closer to 700 words, 1,000 words. So that's not a lot of space. So you need to be able to say things concisely and quickly and accurately. So and you have to be able to write it quickly and accurately. So it's great training ground for learning how to get ideas, get information, and figure out what's important and how to say it quickly and hopefully interestingly, because there's a lot of competition out there, and hopefully your lead will not only inform readers, but hopefully in a way kind of interest and entertain them at the same time.
And you have to write quickly.
Very quickly, yes.
This isn't something where you get a chance to Stanley Kubrick it, where you write
No.
it and go away and think about it and then come back and reflect.
No,
I mean,
especially at these smaller papers. At a place like the Star, there's feature writers who have a lot of time at times. But as smaller papers, when you're writing sometimes 4 stories a day, 4 or 5 stories a day, it's not unusual. Yeah, you're just cranking it out.
Yeah, I mean, my early days at TSN, once you got your assignment, it was off to the races. The clock was never your friend, and you had to learn how to hammer and then review as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So the way we started out in Thunder Bay is back then. This is 1989. It was still an afternoon newspaper, the city paper. There was also a regional morning paper called the Times News. So we would start at 8 in the morning, and we had about 2.5 hours where we were writing for that afternoon paper, right? So if you came in on a Monday morning, you were writing the Monday evening paper. So you would spend the first 2 hours writing news from overnight or whatever, and then you'd start writing for the next day's paper. So you'd start your day trying to if there was a fire or whatever, whatever news happened in Thunder Bay, breaking news, to get into the afternoon paper, and that was kind of your morning rush, and then you'd switch over to working on the next day's paper.
What do people know about what you need to do when you're writing quickly?
Well, you need to know what you're going to say. That's the main thing. Some of the best stories are they just come out of your head because the information's in your head. And if you're looking at your notes and trying to look up quotes and this and that, just say it as if you were telling a friend what happened. That's the way to write quickly. Just you have to clear your mind of the clutter and just say, what is the most important thing that's happening? What do I know? And then you usually have a little bit of time to go back and make sure you got the name spelled correctly and make sure you get a good quote and things like that.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've learned. When you're usually stuck writing something, it's because you don't actually know what you're going to say.
Mm-hmm.
And in television, because you have to write it like people are talking, the best process is to say it out loud and write it down and correct anything if you have to.
Right.
So that's a process that works writing for newspapers as well.
Yep. Yeah. And I think anytime you're doing any kind of writing, it's key to know what you want to say. Because if you don't, you're kind of in trouble and it'll show.
Yeah. And, part of the writing process, when I talk to people writing, when I've held seminars, is your writing actually starts in the research. By the time you're sitting down and putting something down, that you shouldn't have writer's block because you have it all planned out by then. At that point, you're just putting in words.
Right. Now, sometimes people struggle with what to say, right? They've got too much research. And that's where it's important to know, that's where you really need to know what it is, that you're trying to say. What is the story? And it's not easy. Sometimes you don't know, right? You've done this research and you're kind of sitting there and you're scratching your head and you're going what really is the story here? And sometimes, especially the breaking news, if there's, something happening, you don't really know, or like with the budget, right? So last week we had a financial update from the province, or the federal government. And, looking at it at first blush, you may not necessarily know exactly what is the story, the big story here. And sometimes it takes you a little while to figure that out.
I've done sports and science. I haven't really done news. The closest I've come to doing news was on 9/11. And that's one of the few times where I sat in front of the computer. We were working on long feature docs, and we came into the Daily Planet newsroom and said, how can we help? And they gave me the lead story, the wrap up of the data, right? And this was probably a 1, so we were still in it. I remember sitting down in front of that screen and saying, like, what happened here? Like, what do I even say? Mm-hmm. And so I actually had to say, what happened?
Right.
And I remember writing down, today, when the start of the workday in New York City, was the worst disaster, one of the worst disasters in the history of the United States. And then things got worse.
Right.
Because if you think about that first plane hitting, that would have been bad enough.
Yeah.
But what happened after that, so that was one of those times where I just had to sit down and say what happened and actually say it out loud and write it down. And it worked out.
Yeah. But deadlines are great motivators, aren't they?
Oh, they're the best. There is one thing I've learned about myself is it's kind of like Boyle's law. I will inflate to the time necessary for those things. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've learned about even writing, even for long form documentary, is I really like hiring people who've worked in daily, because that urgency has already been drilled into them over days and days and days and days.
Right.
Now, you went from being a reporter to being a columnist. How did you come to be a columnist?
Well, so I was working for the Kingston Whig Standard. I left Thunder Bay, went to Kingston. I was a reporter there and an editor there, mainly a reporter, for 5 years. And then I wanted out because the paper was really suffering financially. And the best way to get a job at that time, which was in the late 90s, and newspaper contraction had already begun, was as an editor. Reporters actually weren't hard to find. Good editors apparently are hard to find. So I ended up becoming an editor full-time. I went to Ottawa, worked for Southern News Service on Parliament Hill for a year. Then I went to the Hamilton Spectator, where I was the page one editor for a year. And then I moved to the Toronto Star a year after that, in 1998, where I was an editor. But what happened is I've always wanted to write. I always felt I was a writer at heart, and I was just kind of dormant because I was actually looking for something to say. I didn't want to just produce writing for the sake of writing. I actually wanted to have a message that I thought would be interesting to people, and hopefully maybe even a little inspirational. So I became a columnist when my wife got pregnant with twins. So I was 46, about to turn 47, and we had to rely on IVF, in vitro fertilization, to get pregnant. And I thought the kind of the struggle we went through was interesting. I thought that people would actually learn from it. So that's what inspired me to think that I actually had something to say that would be worthwhile, that would be entertaining, would be interesting, and would be relevant to people's lives. So that's a key to writing, is make something that's relevant. So I pitched a blog initially with the life editor at the Star, thinking it would just run online. But she liked the idea so much, she said, why don't we make you a columnist? You can write every 2 weeks about your experience. So that kind of kickstarted my writing again, having this venue to write every 2 weeks about what was happening with us.
And what was the secret to writing as a columnist?
Yeah, so that was hard, to say the least. The secret is, luckily, I was writing every 2 weeks, so you had time to think about it, right? So I was biking to work all the time at that point, about 45 minutes each way every day. And during these bike rides, I'd have, be along the waterfront in Toronto, and on a bike path, there's not a lot of traffic. So I'd have time to think. And it was during those bike rides that I would come up with my ideas. And I would essentially write the columns in my head before I even sat down to write them at the computer, which was really useful because having twins and working full time, there wasn't a lot of time. So I would have them mostly formed in my head by the time I sat down. And for topics, I was just trying to find initially something that I thought would be relevant to parents, and maybe hopefully a little bit, entertaining, maybe funny. My market, I figured, would be other parents, either parents with young children or people who wanted to become parents, I found later on, though, that a huge part of the readership of that column was grandparents, because they probably, got the newspaper, and they like to relive those years of their kids or their grandkids. And probably a lot of them were even my age too. So, yeah, so that was it. Like, I really felt the weight of coming up with something interesting. I think the worst thing I wanted to do was bore people, and or give them a reason not to read the column. People aren't going to read your column, even if it's only 700 words, to the end if you're boring them. So, I tried to come up with topics that I thought would be interesting to the most number of people, and try to tap into people's emotions, maybe a little bit of nostalgia. I tried to inform. I tried to, look at modern parenting. I mean, one of my favorite columns was comparing how we were raising kids, you and your children, to how our parents raised us. And at the time, Mad Men was a very popular TV show about life in the 60s. And yeah, I really enjoyed that column in particular.
And you have 700 words. And that's, as you look at it, it's not daunting to read, but you also have to hook people off the top.
Mm-hmm.
What would make a good hook in a column?
Yeah, well, it was, that's tough. It depends on the nature of the column. So you just need something that's going to, I think, be relevant to them, or something like spin a little mystery about what you're struggling with as a father, or whatever. So I mean, it depends on the column. I can't think of anything right off the top of my head, but you just try and get right to the action as soon as you can, whatever the action may be.
Mm-hmm. And two of the things you've talked about, both in the column with the 700 words and in the reporting, is, tight writing.
Mm-hmm. It has to be tight. It's got to move, and you can't waste words. So luckily, being a newspaper, journalist, and even when I wasn't writing as an editor, I was rewriting. Like, I was rewriting every single day. So, even though I wasn't actively writing with the byline, I was really honing my skills as a.
Yeah, I felt the same way when I was reviewing scripts as an executive producer, as you really learned how to cut, mm-hmm. as well as looking at the way different people wrote and the way different people produced. When you go from the creating to the overseeing, it's actually a really good education process. It feels like you're kind of the teacher, but you're every bit as much the pupil when you're going through that part.
Yeah. And I think that, I think every reporter should be an editor for some time to see what it's like on the other side, and it makes them better. But I was going to say, when I was a page one editor, you had to get a certain amount of information before the turn of a story, right? You've got maybe 3, 4, 5 paragraphs before the story turns. And that was really an interesting process. I did that for 2 years. Is how are you going to fit all of this information, vital information, to the story before you turn? So that
before somebody has to literally turn the page.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that was, I did a lot of, I spent, 2 years basically, rewriting every, 3 or 4 front page stories every day to make sure you got all that information, whatever information you needed to get before, you're not going to, a reader's not going to turn the page if they don't know what the story's about, or if they don't care. So, yeah.
Yeah, that is always a challenge. In television, it's the first thing is, why should I watch?
Mm-hmm.
Because there are a lot of reasons not to.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I've never written for television, but you have images too, right? You have to write to the images as much as you can, or not duplicate what the images say. Don't waste your words recreating what the viewer can see with their eyes.
Right to the picture is, I've never thought that's exactly right. It's actually right with the picture.
Mm-hmm.
Picture is part of your vocabulary.
Right.
So it's, I don't know if it's made my job easier or harder than yours, but I've always enjoyed leaning on the talents of really good cameramen to make my job a lot easier. In fact, in television, for a short item, one of my friends says, take your best picture. That's how you start the story. And your second best picture is how you end it.
Mm.
So you
Yep.
really let the pictures drive it a lot. Now, while you were a columnist,
Mm-hmm.
writing about parenting, you actually reconnected with someone from your youth, which led to your book.
Yeah.
What happened
So
there?
one thing that you noticed when you're working for a big newspaper like the Toronto Star is which publicists are paying attention. So not soon soon after I started writing the column, I started getting emails from uh, publicists wanting me to write about something that was totally unrelated to my column, but it had to do with parenting. And one of those emails I got was from a publicist who was working with Hyundai and the car company. And they said, "Would you like to interview NHL hockey dad Carl Subban about what Carl and his son PK are doing with Hyundai hockey helpers?" Now, Carl was a high school basketball coach of mine. He played for the Lakehead University team, which was a top 10 team in the nation. And I attended these basketball camps with Carl, and he was kind of one of my heroes growing up. And I had meant to reconnect with him. I had learned, I had lost track of him in like 1984 when I graduated high school, and he graduated from Lakehead. But his son PK became kind of a junior star, and he was a principal up in Jane Finch, one of the tough neighborhoods in Toronto. And I was in charge of the education team at the time, and they wrote a story about Carl. And I went, wow, this is where Carl ended up. This is cool. I need to reconnect with him. So when I got this email saying, would you like to interview NHL hockey dad Carl Subban? I've been meaning to connect with them, and I just wrote back. My fingers couldn't write fast enough. And I'm like, absolutely. I would love to talk to Carl. And I explained my history with Carl. So they hooked up an interview, and I wrote a profile of Carl in my column because he he has 5 children. PK is the most famous, but he has 5 children, 3 professional hockey players, and 2 teachers, and he was a principal. So he had so much advice to give on parenting and mentoring and inspiring kids that after I got off the interview, I interviewed him over the phone. I said to my wife, I said, Carl needs to write a book about his life, a memoir, and I need to be the one to help him. So I phoned back to the publicist and said, can you either give me Carl's phone number or have him call me? So Carl called me back, and I pitched this idea of a book, and we met down where I live in South Etobicoke for coffee. Actually, it was tea. Yeah, and we decided, yeah, let's write a book. And so we did. And there it is.
Yes, how we did it. The Subban plan for success in hockey, school, and life. What was that process like, writing a book with someone else in their voice?
Yeah, that was really interesting. So the first thing I did when Carl and I agreed to write a book together, I'd never written a book. I didn't have an agent. I didn't really know how the process worked. So I called up a mutual friend of the family, Charlie Wilkins, who's from Thunder Bay. He's friends with our parents. He's written like 15 books. I said, Charlie, I'm going to write a book. And he knew of Carl because he was a big fan of the Lakehead basketball program. He gave me advice, and I hooked up with an agent through his agency. And the advice he told me was, your book is going to be a series of stories, right? Little vignettes, stories. Like, he wrote a book with a guy called, he wrote a book called, Charlie did, called Paddle to the Amazon. And he took the diaries of a man, paddled from Winnipeg down to the mouth of the Amazon River. And he basically, I think, divided it up into 500 little stories. So that was really crucial for me to think of it that way. You're not writing a big book. You are writing, you're not writing a big book. You're writing a series of little stories. And that made it so doable, right? And so to write in Carl's voice actually I didn't find it that challenging, because I would interview him, and I would record it, and then I would have it transcribed. So I had his words. I had hundreds of thousands of his words, and we met every week or every 2 weeks or every month. And so when I was sitting down writing, And I would also interview him. I would supplement the interviews with also I might call him up on the phone, or after I wrote a draft of a chapter, I knew there was some holes, so I'd call him back. And his voice was kind of in my head, and so that was that I didn't find it that challenging. Having the transcripts with his actual words, and then just kind of knowing his personality, spending so much time with him, knowing what his values are, how he spoke. That was probably for me. That was probably the easiest part of the book, was actually writing it in his voice.
And that went on. You had a little tour, little press tour. You went on to become a national bestseller.
Yeah, it
That's not
debuted on
something
the national bestseller list.
What was that like to see that happen?
Yeah, that was super exciting. So we had an event in Toronto where I interviewed Carl in person, and the publisher of the book, Penguin Random House Canada, my editor was there, and so was the publisher of the imprint that night, and they told me that day they found out that we were debuting on the national bestseller list, and I'll never forget that rush of excitement. It was validation. It was just because I had a vision for the book the second I got off the phone with Carl, and I saw this book. I saw what it was. I envisioned it being a national bestseller. And I remember when we spent about a year trying to figure out what the book was going to be. And I remember walking by bookstores in the malls, and there'd be a little table at the front, and there'd be the books. And I remember I took a picture of it with my phone, and I sent it to Carl, and I said, one day our book is going to be on one of those stands. And it was. We were so lucky that I remember walking by an Indigo bookstore in one of the bank towers downtown in Toronto, and there was, hot new releases, and there was our book, right beside. We were actually above a book by Tom Brady, and I remember, look at that, we're above Tom Brady.
Good.
And then when it finally appeared in, and this was a huge thrill for me. It appeared in Costco. And our book was right beside the paperback version of Bruce Springsteen's memoir. And I thought, wow, because Bruce Springsteen is my hero and your hero too. So I thought, this is like, how amazing is this? His book sold a lot more than ours did.
Yeah. He had a bit of a leg up there. And,
yeah.
And one of the reasons I'm doing this is I hope someday to interview Bruce Springsteen on this, but
that'd be
got a long way to go for that.
Yeah.
And so you had this tremendous success with this book, with someone you admired as a child. So you didn't even, not as a child, as a young man, a nice shared experience.
Yeah.
After that, you started looking into things that you could do a little more on your own, and you started writing fiction.
Right.
Or
so it's sorry, what's your question?
About the same time. What was the difference? Well, first of all, why did you decide to write fiction?
Right. Well, I think a lot of writers, when you first start out, back when I was in university, 20 years old, trying to become a writer, I think a lot of writers think that it would be great to write a novel, right? And just a second, I'm having a little issue here. Okay, I'm back. You want to write a novel. So that was always in the back of my head. And before I even became the columnist, I started writing short stories, humorous short stories for when I was at one of the assignment editors at the Star. I had an intern, young guy, very impressive man named Brett Popplewell, and he had a magazine called the Feathertail Review. He asked me to write for it. And they were just humorous stories. I never would have written for it. I never would have thought to do it. But I thought, this would be a good, I have a friendly, person here who's publishing this magazine, which does very, very well, by the way. And so that was a real challenge, and that was always in the back of my mind. So, and I've been writing, for 10 years, I've been writing a story maybe every year, every 2 years. So when we wrote How We Did It, and that was, that just really got that writing bug going. But it's actually very difficult to come up with an idea for a nonfiction book, to do the research, to get a publisher. I've since pitched probably 3 or 4 different nonfiction stories to agents and to publishing houses, and either there isn't a market for it in Canada, or I'm not famous enough as a writer, or whatever. So it all kept leading me back to, you know what, you don't need anyone's help to write a novel. You can do it on your own. It's in your head, and if you write it and nothing happens, there's no big deal. You're not wasting anyone else's time. If you're working with a co-author on a nonfiction book or something. So it was the combination of, I wasn't able to get a nonfiction publishing deal. I tried. And also, it's been something that was germinating in the back of my head for a long time. So for me, and it was, I had been inspired about writing about Thunder Bay, and in particular writing about where we worked as summer students. This crazy place called Canada Malting on the
Yeah, we all
waterfront.
have that place.
Yeah, so that, what I really wanted to do is, I wanted to write about a coming of age story about Canada Malting and Thunder Bay, which is such a unique frontier city in the middle of the Canadian Shield, that I thought, okay, this is it. I'm really going to focus my efforts on fiction and also time, like, being a parent and having kids. The twins are 8 now, job and all the stresses. I didn't really have time to research and go out and take time off work to, go chasing down stories and traveling around, whatever. So, I can create pockets of time here and there in my day to write fiction where I wouldn't have to write nonfiction.
And for the people who don't know, as we do, Canada Malting is still a grain elevator in Thunder Bay, and they take the barley that comes from out west, they bring it in, they germinate it and turn it into malt that goes into beer.
Right, and then it gets shipped off in these giant boats that come up the St. Lawrence Seaway and take it to places all around the world.
And it was a very enviable job because it paid a lot.
Paid really well.
That you and me and our brother Jim had jobs there to put us through university.
Mm-hmm.
But it was filled with older people who had lived lives that we hadn't seen before.
Yeah.
The book that you wrote, I think you've talked about novels, but the book that you wrote is a series of short stories called Tales from the North Shore. Yes. And it's all mostly fictional, although there is one story in there that I believe, at least a couple that are inspired by true events. Certainly one has the tale of a heroic young man who takes on a scary figure that has been created for us. That's probably my favorite story in there.
Yes, I can see why. Yeah, terrorizing a demonic Finnish trapper who wants to cut your leg off while you're sleeping.
Yes, I encourage people to read that story and look for the incredibly heroic deeds that conclude the story.
The twist ending is
yes, that no one can see coming.
With the twist ending.
And that one is based on a tale that was told to us. Our father's a research scientist. He had students at a research camp who created a character called Stumpfoot, who's lost a leg in a trapping accident and was out looking for another leg. Mm-hmm. And we were always afraid that he would come looking for ours. But Tales from the North Shore, tales all around, some from Thunder Bay, some from here, close to the Great Lakes. Mm-hmm. What was the challenge of writing fiction?
Yeah, so writing fiction, I found it very intimidating because it all has to come out of your head, right? And luckily for me, there's nothing keeping thoughts in my head that can just flow right out of my head. So that was the hardest part, because with nonfiction, with reporting, you research facts, and I'm a good researcher, having been a journalist. So you gather your facts, and then you figure out hopefully the most entertaining way and relevant way to tell that story. With fiction, you gotta come up with characters, you gotta come up with names, you gotta come up with dialogue, you gotta come up with everything. So that was super intimidating. I remember sitting down writing the first story for Feathertail, and I thought it was a great story. And my friend Brett read it, and he goes, "This is a great story, but I'm never going to publish it because it's not funny." So, all right, okay, I'll come back with a funny story. So I still have that story. It hasn't been published, but I'm going to turn it into something someday. But it's coming up with the idea and the characters but also like the thing that kind of terrifies me as a writer is trying to make it interesting. Like the last thing you want to do is bore somebody, or especially if someone buys your book out of obligation, like a friend or a family member, right? When they pick it up and they go, "Oh, I'm going to read Scott's book, or I'm going to read Scott's thing," and it's like, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is so boring." And how did he ever think this was interesting? And I mean, I've written enough that I know how to write. I know how to put together sentences, and I know how to tell a story, to some degree. But yeah, coming up with the idea and the characters that people will find interesting is super intimidating. So that was a big departure from nonfiction.
Well, one of the reasons I'm doing this is this little talk show is because I've worked in all different types of just television storytelling, from science to history to murder. They all of them have their own characteristics and different ways of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
So, I love your writing, and you're right. You write the elegant, simple sentences that just are absorbed so easily. But just because you can write one thing doesn't mean you're going to be successful
No,
writing something else.
that's true. And so, like with Tales from the North Shore, I self-published it. I didn't even try to approach a publisher because I knew the market was limited. It was a disjointed series of stories. Or three are set in Thunder Bay, three are set in Toronto, Etobicoke, where I live. They're odd, they're quirky. Some of them are a little dark. Um, the two of them are memoirs based on events of my life, and I just knew that it wasn't going to have a mass appeal. But I thought that the stories, I was proud of them, and I thought they were entertaining, and I thought they were funny. So when I was asked to read one of the stories, Brett put one of the stories on his website, and it involves passenger pigeons, which were hunted into extinction in the 19th century. When they anyway, I wrote a story because Mimico, I live near Mimico, a community in Toronto. It's the indigenous word for where wild pigeons gather. They used to gather by the hundreds of thousands before migrating. And so I incorporated passenger pigeons into a story that's set in Mimico, and they come back in a demonic form and wreak havoc on society. So I was asked to read that story at Humber College, which is just down the street from where I live, because the curator of this museum, which was doing a project on the impact of passenger pigeons and their legacy in this area, found my story doing a Google search and liked it and asked me to come read it. So I was terrified to do that because that was not written for me to read in front of an audience, you know. And but anyway, it inspired me to pull the stories together into a book. And I always imagined that story would be part two of a three-part series, a trilogy. So that inspired me to write the third part and put it together in a book. And so that's how Tales from the North Shore came about. And yeah, I was quite proud of it. The third part I actually rewrote. So this is a good lesson for writing. I had a very quick deadline. I had to get it done in a month so I could get the book published, self-published, designed, printed, and ready for sale on July 17th of last year, 2019. And so I wrote a story, and I was happy with it. I thought it was okay. I liked where it went. But then I showed it to my friend Brett, who publishes the Feathertail Review, and he said, "This is good. It's too long," and so for me to use in his magazine. So I shortened it, and I made it funnier, and I made it better. So not to discredit anyone buying Tales from the North Shore, but writing is rewriting. That's something we wanted to talk about. And if I had, in a perfect world, I would have taken more time to write that third part. I'm still very happy with what appears in the book, but by shortening it, and Brett had some good ideas, we actually made it a lot funnier. So, that's part of it. Like sometimes you don't have time to make it exactly right. And being a journalist, I'm not a perfectionist. So I met my deadline. It all worked out. And then I had the opportunity to rewrite it, and I jumped at that opportunity. And so now I've got two versions of that story, and I'm happy with both of them.
Yep. What people who don't write don't understand, and people who I think get a lot of writer's block don't understand, is most of writing is rewriting.
Mm-hmm.
And cutting down is Stephen King says your second draft is your first draft minus 20%. And we used to have to do these international versions of the shows that we did. They would be, the domestic versions were 24 minutes, and the international versions were 24 minutes. The domestic were 22:30. So you would have to cut out 2.5 minutes. And of course, you've made these perfect jewels. And I always think, oh, we're going to ruin the show by taking 2.5 minutes out. And we never ruined the show. It was almost always better.
Yeah, it usually is. And even with our book, How We Did It, I wrote 100,000 words, and I think the final version was 78,000 words. So I cut out over 20,000 words. I think I spiked 3 chapters from the version I handed in to the publisher, and from what we finally did, and we made the book better. And that's the other thing about having a great editor too. She was fantastic. We were totally simpatico.
Do you remember what those words were?
Yeah, there's a lot of the, and.
Some things keep coming up.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, there was a lot more I wanted to talk to you about, and maybe we'll have to do this again sometime just to talk about opinion pages. But
Right.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Really appreciate it. Really enjoy your writing, and I look forward to seeing what's happening next. And how can people get your books?
Well, you can buy How We Did It pretty much anywhere. It was published all across North America. And you can buy Tales from the North Shore on Amazon.ca.
And you should definitely get Tales of the North Shore just to read the heroic actions in this Stumpfoot story.
You will not believe. It's a true story. Every word of that is the God's truth.
A lot of it is true.
Yeah.
All right, Scott, thanks very much.
Thank you.
We'll see you in one of our backyards shortly.
We will. And everyone out there, if you want to write, do it. Make the time. Don't be scared. And your first draft will always suck.
Yep. We're a little over, but I want to tell one little story. It's Glenn Fry from the Eagles used to hang around with Bob Seger, and he used to play with him and sing background. Apparently you can really hear him on Ramblin' Gamblin' Man. And he said to Bob Seger, listen, I want to write songs, but I'm afraid they're going to suck. And Bob Seger said, well, they're going to, but you just keep writing until they don't anymore. So the only way to learn to write is to write and to learn and to listen, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this. I want to get everybody's secrets. And thanks for sharing yours, Scott.
Okay, thank you. See you later.
We'll see you in one of our backyards one of these days. And that is it for Narrative Drive Time. Are you a storyteller who wants to tell the story of how you tell stories? Yes? Then I want to hear from you. Drop me a line at craig@colbyvision.net and tell me a little bit about yourself, your career, and some of the particulars of your process. Colbyvision is a storytelling company working in the broadcasting and the business world. Send me an email if you need help with either. Thanks to Tim Vesely for the music, and Kevin Francisco for the graphics, and Dave White for the editing. And thanks to you for watching Narrative Drive Time.